Welcome back to the Burning Branches podcast.
I open the Bible and the first thing that comes to mind is, as the deer longs after the water creek, so does my soul longs after you. That's why I close my Bible, I get in my car, and I feel the inclination to just drive through this park that I always go to. And I go through where there's this water creek, and so I'm standing by the water creek just enjoying the view, enjoying the sunshine and everything, and I see 3 deers walking from the bush, walk into the water creek. Three deers. And as they walk into the water creek, they drink from the water. So I'm in the break room, and everything just hits me. Like, oh my God, revelation just happened in front of my face. And I had no clue. It took me 2 hours later to realize that. So now, 4 months later, I go back.
This is something special.
Welcome back to the Burning Branches podcast. Today we're delving into the mysteries of an altar.
What does it mean to have an altar? What does it mean to raise an altar or to dismantle an altar?
What does an altar look like in the modern day?
And is any of this still relevant to us? And so let's get into it. When we look at the history of altars, you kind of zoom in a little bit on any culture in history. And you're going to find at the root of all of their religious practices the concept of an altar. Now, they all have their different names for it, of course, but it's essentially a flat surface upon which an offering or a sacrifice is made, usually to a deity or something that they're worshiping. And you can find this from Asian cultures to African cultures to European cultures. You can find this in Native American cultures. It's just a surface upon which they sanctify for the purpose of worship via sacrifice, right? And one of the interesting things is if you Google who built the first altar in the Bible, you're going to find Noah, right? He's the famous one. He builds that altar immediately after the flood. But interestingly enough, by the definition of an altar as a flat surface upon which an offering is placed, we look at Cain and Abel. Now, it just says they made an offering. It doesn't say anything about an altar. But by definition, whatever they put that offering of was an altar. And so we see them building the first altar. And I think this is really hit home to me when God showed this to me, that it was at the altar the first sin between brothers was committed, right? Because God is judging the offering that's being made. And God already knows the hearts of both of them. And what's the sin of Cain? Well, you liked my brother's offering more than me. And it's that envy, it's that pride, that jealousy. And it's that sin, it manifests at the altar, right? And so it's interesting. We see this reflected even in the New Testament when Jesus says, if you go to the altar to make an offering and you realize that your brother has something against you or you have something against him, you leave your offering. Don't even worry about the offering. You can go make your heart right. You go make it right with your brother. And so we see the altar as this place of unity, right? It's this concept of togetherness. Without togetherness, it doesn't work, right? Biblically speaking.
That's right. I think it's just so intriguing. It's extremely intriguing that the first thing Noah does after surviving a flood over 100 days, the first thing he does, and I think the first thing he would do is to celebrate. Like, dude, we've been in this ark forever. The first thing he does is he builds an altar. And I always thought, like, why is he building an altar? But if you read the word, it says that he built an altar and he offered burnt sacrifices unto God. And God, he smelled the fragrances of the sacrifice that he burnt out. And for that very reason, God made it upon himself that he's not going to destroy the world with water again. So the reason why God thought within his heart that he was not going to destroy the earth anymore is because Noah built an altar and burnt it. And in the process where God smells the aroma, the essence of the sacrifice, that caused him to make the decision to not destroy the earth with water again. I thought that was so powerful when I thought about that. And I know that we talk about Elijah and how Elijah goes up against the prophets of Baal and how he establishes the altar and how he repairs the broken altar and he gathers all the rocks according to the tribes of what? The tribes of Israel, according to the tribes of Israel, and he calls on to God. But what are altars, like you say? Personally, for my own personal decision, I think altars are platforms where the spirit realm meets the physical realm on legal basis. legal. It's an established position in a geographical location where the spirit realm has authorization to legislate what the spirit realm is causing into the physical realm. And the reason I say this, we see Jacob goes right back to Abraham, where Abraham made a sacrifice, which is what, Bethel. We see Jacob go right back there, and he had no clue that his father had built an altar there. And that's the very place where he sees the ladder that leads into heaven, where he sees God and he sees angels coming up and down. And so I think altars are platforms where the spirit realm makes physical manifestations in the world on legal basis.
That kind of spurred to mind when God gives Adam and Eve dominion over the earth, right? And so as people, we have dominion over everything around us, right? We have the ability to create governments. We have the ability to write laws and all these things. We have complete dominion over what happens and what passes. So based on what you're saying, it's almost like we take a moment, we take a set apart side. We're like, okay, we're using all this other space for all these other things, but this is the space where I want to make a transaction
100%.
with something in the spirit world. This is whether it's God or whether it's something that wants to co-opt God's worship or something else. You know,
100%.
we set aside that place, and we're like, okay, I make a legal transaction with the IRS over here, and I make a legal transaction with my landlord over here.
That's right.
But over here, I make a legal transaction with God.
That's right. This is exactly what it is. Because we see Jacob, he rests after he flees from his brother Esau. Because in his mind, he's thinking Esau is just looking for him to kill him. You know, so now he goes on his journey and he lays down right at Bethel and he grabs a rock and he lays his head on it. And as he grabs a rock and lays his head on it, he gets this revelation of heaven. And as soon as he wakes up, he says, the Lord was here and I knew not. And what he does is he grabs the rock and he takes the rock with him. And he's saying that this rock signifies that I've met God. This rock signifies that I've met God. And what he does is he pours oil over that rock and he makes that platform, that stage, a position where he thinks this is where I met God. This is where I'm going to try to meet God every single time. So I think it adds to the aspect that the altars are platforms where the spirit realm makes legislation into the physical realm. And even if we think about it as humans, right, we are altars. We have to offer ourselves unto God as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable unto God. It ties into what altars are if you really think about it. Because if we make ourselves as altars, as humans, we're given the word of God, we're given the light of God, authority to legalize power through us. We're given the word of God authority to give us like legal legislation of what the kingdom of God really looks like. So I think as much as platforms can be signified as altars, I also think humans can be altars as well in the biblical context. Like every single one of us as Christians, we're altars in a sense, where God can make legal legislation through us. If we offer ourselves unto God as a burning sacrifice unto him, I don't know if it makes sense to add to the whole thought, but.
No, I understand where you're coming from. And even when you think about an altar and a sacrifice, what is a sacrifice?
Mm-hmm.
It's a willing giving up of something that is valued.
Mm-hmm.
It's a willing surrendering to something that you are not sure how it's going to work out, but you willingly give it in hope and in faith that this offering, this sacrifice of self, of will, of pleasure, whatever it might be, that thing that you worked for, that in willingly giving it up, God will be able to give you something better. God will be able to give you something in return that you knew not, something that you didn't even know was possible or could even exist.
That's right.
It's interesting how that kind of ties together with what I heard I'll just go ahead and give him credit, Jordan Peterson. I heard him say
You love
that
Jordan Peterson.
I do.
David.
He conceptualized ancient people's understanding of they might not have been able to articulate things, but they acted them out, right? And so when you understand like symbolism through that lens, through a symbolic where the acting out is the learning of something, then when you understand the action of placing something on an altar is just like exactly what you were saying. It's like, I don't know how this is going to work out. Like if you look at the physical action of it, right? Like we can have all this metaphysical stuff going on in our head, like, oh, this is a holy place, whatever. But if you just look at the physical action of like, I'm going to put this pin on this table and I'm going to leave it there and I'm going to leave, and that pin doesn't belong to me anymore. And then it's like, wait a minute, well, then who gets the pin? Physically speaking, it makes no sense, right?
Right.
But every human innately knows that, like, I'm going to put something into the uncertainty of the future, and I'm going to give that up. Who am I going to give that up to? And what am I going to give that up to? And that's the significance.
That's what it is.
Right?
That's what it is. That's what it is.
And it's like, well, if you give it up to God, the creator of heaven and earth, well, then he can create something out of that because he's a creator. But if you give it up to somebody who destroys and who lies and steals, he's going to take that. And he's going to further lies and destruction and stealing, right?
Right.
And and you think about how even the Greeks would take their altars and they would say, okay, you want to worship the goddess of drunkenness or the god of the oceans or whatever, because you're going to go on a ship or you're going to go out, in debauchery or whatever, and you would sacrifice something. Like, it's like you're paying a tax. You're paying. You have to pay something forward in order to partake in this thing, in order to assure that it's going to be well kept. That some force outside of yourself is going to act on your behalf, right?
That's right.
And the only way to get its attention is by being willing to give something of substance of yourself. It's the only way you can get its attention.
That's right.
And it's like these are rules that were set up long time ago. And we simply act them out because we understand them intrinsically. I have to give something up before I can move forward.
100%.
And to bring it back to kind of what you were saying about giving up of yourself, right? It's like you take that upon yourself, and how you can become an altar. It's almost like we need to act that out in order to understand it, right? We need to designate a place that we can
100%.
do that for us to really understand it.
100%.
Right? You could do it everywhere, but you need a place to set aside that gets your mind in that state. Like, this is the place that I go. This is the place that I enter into. That when I do, I'm offering myself to this higher power, to God, to my Creator, to my Savior. I'm going to offer myself to Him in the way that He offered Himself to me.
That's right. Yeah, no, because if you truly think about it, when I was reading through when the Abrahamic promise came to Abraham, the first thing Abraham does is he builds an altar, and the word makes it a point to make us know that who the altar was built to. He says he built an altar unto God, which also implies that you can build an altar unto other things. Because I'm like, why is the Bible making it a point to make us know that he built an altar unto God? Because that means that you can build an altar into other things. So, like, even with that understanding, we have to also think that the whole idea of altars was something like, say, now we have demonic altars, right? Not to veer off too much, but now we have demonic altars. We have other altars, right? And all those altars are concepts that was taken from God's idea of what altars are. And I bring this up in a sense because we as humans, if we consider ourselves as altars, that means our altars can be dedicated to other things, whether it be our job, whether it be our relationships, whether it be whatever the case is, whatever we're tied so much to can be an altar. So the Bible makes it a point that Abraham built an altar unto God. That means we can build altars unto other things. So the real question would be, what altars are we building ourselves to?
Yeah.
What are we authorizing? What are we given legal basis to authorize through us as altars? Does it make sense? Because, but when I think about it, I think about it in that deeper connotations. Like, man, if you really think about it, man, we're given authorizations for other things to just manifest through us without us even really paying this deeper understanding to that. And it's just so intriguing.
Yeah. I heard a preacher say once, actually it wasn't a preacher, but I heard a man say once, he said that when you allow lust to reproduce through you, it's like you're allowing lust to possess you, because you're no longer in possession of your mind. You're letting something else possess you. And he kind of conceptualized spiritual possession in that way. And though I don't think that's 100% of it, I think that's onto something, right? It's like when you let anger manifest itself through you, as what does it say biblically? It says, be angry, but sin not in your anger.
That's
like,
right.
don't let it produce something.
Right.
So it's almost like by giving something else sort of a legal right over you, you're giving a part of yourself away to something else. It is going to attempt to bear fruit through you, right? Because it wants to take that part of yourself that you're giving it, and it wants to make more of itself through other people in the world around
To
you,
produce through you.
right? And that's fruit, right? That's the entire concept of fruit.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of circle back around. You had made a point about when Jacob recognized that God was there.
Mhm.
He said, "Oh, God was here and I knew not." Then he knew to build an altar. It's like those are all of the landmark points we find in the Old Testament in any kind of tale or story. It's like when you find a spiritual source, you're like, "Oh, this is a place I need to build an altar." So there is like a locational specificity with that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that all of the altars that were built by the Old Testament fathers, they all came back in the New Testament, right? They all, and over again in the Old Testament. Like they became these places of significance with which the spiritual world was literally authoring the physical world around.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And I also always find it intriguing that I don't know if you guys have read the entire story of how Gideon is called from fear to a man of valor, right? And the first assignment that God gives Gideon is to go into his father's house and dismantle the altar of Baal. And when I was reading this text, I'm thinking, like, why would God allow him to do that as his first assignment? Because after he destroys the altar, what he does is God tell him that as soon as you destroy the altar, what you're going to do, Gideon, is you're going to establish an altar for me. And I think God understands that he cannot manifest himself there if there's an altar built to a different God. So the first thing that Gideon needs to do is to dismantle that altar so he can establish an altar onto God. And I think it's just so important that before we allow God to manifest himself through us legally, we have to identify all the altars that we've placed within our lives that needs to be dismantled and then establish God's altar. But back to what you were saying, though, I think three months ago, right, I'm in I opened the Bible, and the first thing that comes to mind is, "As the deer longs after the water creek, so does my soul longs after you." So, I'm reading this whole psalm. I don't know if it's Psalm 51 or 41. I'm not so sure what it is. And so I close my Bible, I get in my car, and I'm driving up to this grocery shop right next to my house to go get some groceries to make breakfast. And I felt the inclination to just drive to this park that I always go to. So, I make a quick right turn, I go to the park, and I go to where there's this water creek sitting. So I'm standing by the water creek, just enjoying the view, enjoying the sunshine and everything. And I see 3 deers walking from the bush, walk into the water creek. Three deers. And as they walk into the water creek, they drink from the water. And I'm standing there. At that moment, I had no understanding of what's going on. I'm like, oh my goodness, there's 3 deers. I get my camera out, and I'm videoing like, it's Kenny. I'm recording all this video. I'm like, man, this is good content. So I get back in my car, I go buy all the groceries, get back home. I eat breakfast, and I go to work about an hour later. So I'm in the break room, and everything just hits me. I'm like, oh my God, revelation just happened in front of my face. And I had no clue. It took me 2 hours later to realize that. So now, 4 months later, I go back and I build an altar there. Intentionally, because that was the root cause. So that was the source of my pursuit over the past 3-4 months. Because God reveals scriptures in front of me. 3 is the number of perfection, I've been told. And the deer is walking into the water. According to my pastor, the deer drinking the water. It means God is going to be my source for the season that I'm walking into. And there's no lie about that. For the past 3-4 months, God has truly been my source. So about 3-4 days later, I go back to that same water creek. I'm like, God, you know what? Your son is back, man. Like, this is where the revelation started for me. And I'm appreciative of that. I understand the level of revelation that you gave me here. So I'm back to the position, like David, you're saying. I'm back here to establish something because I felt a supernatural connection that happened here. And I thought that was just so powerful. And that's kind of like my own story, a physical story as how altars are so close to my heart.
Yeah. That's powerful, man. That's
Really,
an experience.
Thank you. Something special.
I think it's interesting that when God commands, he has a specific way to build altars, right? And when it comes to any other altar that's built throughout history, and I can't speak for every culture, but most of them, they're shaping the altar in some way. They're building some sort of a square, table, whatever. And God says, when you build an altar for me, make sure that you don't touch it with a tool, right? And that's interesting.
That is interesting.
Because he's saying that the thing that I created, I want the thing that I created to bring worship to me, not the thing that you created. He's like, that's going to be the vessel for worship. And what are we? We're the thing that he created, right? And he's like, you can dress it up and you can make it pretty and you can put a tool on it. That's fine, but you're taking something away from the thing that I created.
That's right.
And I want you to offer worship on the thing that I created. because it's perfect.
Mhm.
So you look at a rock, right? You look at this big flat rock you find out in the wilderness. And God said, that's good. That's perfect to put it on, right?
Mhm.
You don't have to dress it up. You don't have to chisel it in a certain shape, because the moment you do so, you're putting your own ego onto it. You're putting your own desires. You're putting your own willpower. You're like, it should look like this, or the worship to God should be shaped in this way.
Mhm.
And God's like, no, the way that I made it. And it's like that calls to something within us where he's like, no, exactly how I set it up. It's interesting you mentioned the altars to Baals. I was doing quite a bit of research on this over the past few months, and interesting thing about the word Baal is that we read Baal like it's a person, but it's not. It's a title. And it's actually just a category of the Canaanite gods. They called them, it was like where they called Jehovah, they called him Adonai, right? That means Lord.
Right.
But other gods would be called Baal instead of Adonai. And so there was this cultural combat that was constantly going on. It's like, do you worship Baal or do you worship Adonai? And they both the words meant Lord or master. And so literally when God's saying, tear down the altars to Baal, he won't even name who it is. He will not even dignify that idol with whatever men want to call it. He just says, go take that false Lord and you rip it down, because like you said, the true Lord desires to be worshipped there, right? That's his place. And you see that so many times in the Old Testament. He sends
So many
prophets
times.
and he says,
So
go
many
rip
times.
down the altars of the Baal.
So many times.
And there's a part that really caught my eye in Hosea. I heard a preacher, he was preaching out of this, and but he said, you will no longer know me as Baali. He said, you will know me as Ishi. And so he says, you will not know me like one of these idols, as some distant god, as some things. Ishi means man. He says, you will know me as a man. And so what does God require his worship to be performed through? The thing that he created. What did he create? He created man. What did he manifest himself? As a man, as that creation. And so his worship was perfected on the altar of Jesus. Right? Another interesting thing, when you look at how the temple was made, right? When God gave specific commandments, there were 2 altars. There were 2. Now, interesting, one God asking for 2 altars. Why is that, right? Well, one was for sacrifices and one was for incense. They were not the same altar, and they were on opposite ends of the temple. And when they would take the sacrifice, they would kill it on the eastward altar, and then they would dip the blood, and they would take the blood and carry it all the way to the western part of the temple and sprinkle it on the mercy seat, right? Because that east to west walk is significant, because God removes your sins as far as the east is from the west. Now, why is it east and west and not north? Because there's a north. There's a point, but there's no point that says the easternmost part. It's infinite. But then the interesting thing is that altar of incense, the one that sits there, that kept burning.
Love it.
Right? And so when we apply that to a modern understanding, we can understand that, like, okay, so Jesus fulfilled that altar of sacrifice, right? He sacrificed himself. And the blood was sprinkled on the mercy seat in heaven, right? That part was fulfilled. But the altar to incense never went away. That keeps burning, right?
That's right.
And that's where our altar begins, right? Because Jesus made the offering for sin, and now we offer the prayer, and the prayer goes up day and night as incense before God.
That's right. Yes, I think it's just so intriguing, because there's an aspect of an altar that needs to be established as well. That altars are created for continuity. They're created for continuity, and like you said, Jesus Christ's death is a representation of an altar, because every time someone confesses in Africa, or any time someone confesses in Japan, he doesn't have to come back and die again. So salvation is powered by that altar. Salvation is something that continuous. It's I don't know what the other word is, but I think it's just continuity.
Like legacy, it has a legacy.
Yes. So like you don't have to come down and do it all over again. And so like once you establish an altar, it's like the Abrahamic promise. An altar was established to signify the promise, and so now there's a continuity with that promise. So it's not like God has to come down again to every single man that, hey, I'm gonna make your seeds like the sands on the beach, or whatever the case is. So there's an aspect of an altar that needs to be understood to enhance continuity in whatever the promise is.
When you consider the depth and the things that are required from an altar, right? The things that it requires from you, the mindset that it requires, right? But it's interesting, in all of these things, the center point is worship.
Mm-hmm.
So from sacrifice to prayer to to an offering, to the first fruits, right? To Cain and Abel, the
Mhm.
first fruit of their thing is a place of worship, right? And worship is recognizing you're bigger than I am. You're better than I am. You're the most beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I adore you. It's a true expression of love and
Mhm.
reverence,
Mm-hmm.
right? And worship isn't this thing that I think a lot of people kind of associate with it, where it's like this kind of forced thing. It's like, you're gonna love me, if you don't love me, you're gonna go to hell. It's like, well, no, if you don't love God, then you can't produce love,
That's right.
because His presence is going to just produce it out of you. It's going to be spontaneous, and it's amazing. It's a marvelous thing.
Mm-hmm.
And when His presence produces that love out of you and that worship, then guess what? Just like you said, God is God of continuity. So now there's love for other things
Mm-hmm.
other than yourself.
Right.
So it's placing God as higher than you, which allows you to place other things as higher than
Yeah.
you.
Mm-hmm.
That's the sin of Cain,
Yeah.
right? Because he could not produce love for his creator.
That's
He could
right.
not produce love for his brother,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so worship is intrinsic in that. And I would say even further than that, I would say worship is at the core of everything that you
Mhm.
sacrifice at an altar, right? Because we think of worship as this one-dimensional thing, as like an expression. It's a physical expression. Maybe it's with hands held high, or maybe it's with your voice producing a sound or a
Mhm.
song, prayer. We have this kind of one-dimensional nature, but other things can be worship too if worship is at the core of how they're produced, right? So what kind of things can you put on an altar?
That's a great question. I don't know if I have the intuitiveness now, but the first thing I could think about is what you can put at the altar as your inadequacy, your insufficiencies, your lacks. You can put at the altar, and I think there's an aspect of brokenness that
Mhm.
God just truly just loves. And I think David in the Bible understands
Yeah.
that so much. And there's this prayer in Psalm that just holds so dear to my heart. David says that, let the lifting of my hands be like an evening sacrifice unto you. And let the lifting of my hands be like an incense burnt onto you. And David understood that so much that I don't necessarily need a physical location. I don't need to be in the temple because this is when David was fleeing away, when Saul was chasing after him.
That's true.
So he didn't have the luxury to be part of the evening sacrifice that happens at 3 p.m. So now he's running, he's in the cave, but that does not stop David. He said, as much as I'm not in the temple being able to sacrifice to God and be a part of all this burning of incense, even though I'm in the cave now, I'm still going to use my body as a representation of what an altar is, which is worship, like you talked about, David. So let the lifting of my hands, Abba, let it be like an evening sacrifice unto you. Let the lifting of my hands be like an incense burn onto you. I think if we truly want to look at a person that exemplifies worship, an altar, Jacob and David are just phenomenal characters in the Bible.
It's interesting that you mentioned brokenness too. That's something that God had to teach me, is that because David writes, he said, what does he say? An animal sacrifice, I'm going to paraphrase, an animal sacrifice you did not require from me. He said, broken spirit and a contrite heart. That's what you require from me.
That's right.
And then he goes on to say, after I've done these things, then I can make my sacrifices unto you. And so God had to teach me that what that meant was you're going to have a broken spirit. God doesn't break your spirit. The world breaks your spirit. The things around you break your spirit. Your enemies try to break your spirit. And that's good. That's a good thing, right? Some people, they pride themselves on having an unbreakable spirit. I have an unbendable will. You can't shake me. That's not a good thing. That's pride, sir. No, what's a good thing is to allow your spirit to be broken,
That's
but
right.
you don't give that spirit to your enemy. You don't give your spirit to the thing that broke it. You then take that, and you take that to your altar, and you put that on the altar, and you say, God, this broken spirit, this is all I got right now. It's yours now. And then you leave that there.
Right.
But that's the beautiful part of an altar, is that you leave it there, right? And so you might think like, oh, if I got, let's put it into money standards. I know people don't like to talk about that too much, but we'll put it in just for the simplicity of the illustration. If you got $10 and you're like, the first fruit sacrifice of this is $1, I'm going to walk up to this rock and I'm going to put $1 at it, and then I'm going to leave, and I'm not going to take that dollar back. That's God's dollar now. Like you didn't hand it to nobody. You just put it on a rock and left it. That's God's offering, right? But then if you kind of take that same concept and you're like, okay, I'm going to take this broken spirit, I'm going to put it on this altar now. God, that's your broken spirit. And then you leave and you don't get that back. That's God's now. You left that as a sacrifice. Now you're clean. Now you're fresh. Now what God can do is he can pour other things through you, and then you can make your sacrifices of the bulls and the calves or whatever God has required of you, right? It's like he says, the thing that's weighing you down, I want that. That's the one that I want first. And then we can talk about the other stuff.
And it's oftentimes that thing that is weighing us down is that thing that we value most. It's that thing that we would be willing to do just about anything not to give up. And so when you think about a sacrifice or an altar and what you can give up or what you should give up, if that is your prayer, ask God. Ask God to reveal to you what is that thing that you value most. And he will. He will bring it to light immediately. And it's not always something that when he brings it to mind, you can immediately sacrifice. It's, there's, I guess I never really considered it, but there was a reason that, he, who took his son to the mountain to sacrifice? Abraham and Isaac. There was a reason he had to go on a journey to sacrifice. There were some hills he had to go up. There were some valleys he had to go through. It wasn't just one straight road or here it is. Here's this thing that you need to do.
I'm going to stop next door at Altar Mart.
He needed some time to contemplate, to really consider the weight of his actions, to arrive at a place. Yes. To arrive at a climax, to arise at a position that culminated to understand the seriousness of the action he was about to do.
That's right.
And that's when God revealed himself as the ultimate sacrifice.
I think that's such a powerful revelation, David. It's such and I was actually reading that text like you were as well. And it's like, why didn't God just tell him, hey, take your son, build an altar maybe just half a mile away from where your tents are? No. It took Abraham 3 days. 3 days. I'm like, God, why 3 days? Like that was the first night I talked to myself, why 3 days? Imagine 24 hours, 48 hours, and 72 hours? 72 hours to contemplate on an action.
Wow.
72 hours. Like, oh man, do I really want to do this? Why am I, man, this is the only thing that I've ever wanted for my entire life. And now I have it now. And it's taking me 42 hours to contemplate whether I want to give this thing up or not. I mean, tell me to do it now and I just get it over with. But no, it's for 78 hours now. You're contemplating. You're in your head. You're like, can I really do this? Why do I have to do this? And that whole space, that contemplating space, is just something that literally can paralyze a person. If I'm being honest, if you have so much time to decide on something, like sometimes you end up not deciding, or you end up like turning away. Like imagine if Abraham would have just turned back. But 3 days.
It's funny, sometimes as we progress on our Christian walk, we oftentimes one of the prayers, God, reveal that thing that is within me that is not like you and help me to become more like you. And then life will begin to draw out those things that are not like God. That might come out in attitudes, it might come out in action. And sometimes we can, belittle ourselves, berate ourselves because why am I acting like this? Why am I doing this? Why am I doing that? But it's literally a prayer being manifest of God, drawing those things out of you that are not like him so that he can take you along that journey so that you can, once you really realize the fullness or the weight of your actions and the seriousness of every word that you say and everything that you do, every second glance, God brings that to a place where you can look at it and say, God, you can do more with this than I ever will. And I trust you with it.
So good.
That's
so good.
I think that's a place we have to return to over and over and over and over.
Literally.
Or another thing pops up and it's like, oh, now I have to take this to the altar. Another thing pops up. I have to take that to the altar. And we just learn this continual action of like these things that are a part of us. And we're like, oh, I need to give this to God. I need to learn to lay this down. I need to learn to hand it over and walk away.
Yes.
And then what's interesting, but on the flip side of that, what's another sacrifice? Just like you said, the raising of the hands, that joy, that like, hey, there's no incense around.
I think that's the other side.
Yeah.
That's the other side of it. It's not just I'm going to lay this thing on the altar and then I'm just going to sit and wait, watch and hope something happens. It's I'm going to lay it down and I'm going to worship because I know I have some revelation of who God is. And, that only revelation might just be that God is faithful.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you're new to your walk with God, and all you know is like, hey, God took me from a really bad spot to here, and here is a lot better than where I was. And so you just praise God for his faithfulness in that, but then you might walk a couple more years and you learn about God's provision, and you might walk a little bit longer and you learn about God's faithfulness and his trust and his trustworthiness.
It's deep.
And each year, each moment that we give, we get a greater revelation, a greater understanding of who God is. And that's why oftentimes in the Old Testament, when God fights for his people or God makes a covenant, with a man, the man will name that place. And I know me and you were talking about this earlier, but those places became revelation points for the people of understanding the nature of God.
That's true. And to piggyback off that point, it's interesting how to get into the mind of somebody who is in Jacob's tribe, right? Because there was a whole tribe with him when he was at Bethel.
Yeah.
A whole tribe. It wasn't just Jacob and his boys. It was like there's a whole bunch of people following him around, doing what he says. This guy knows what's up. His God is a good God. We're going to follow that guy. And it's interesting how that revelation point affected all of those people that were around there, right? And I like to get in the mindset of one of those people. Like, what did worship look like and feel like for one of those people? It's just not Jacob, but the people around Jacob. The people who are affected by Jacob and his act, who Jacob has responsibility over, and by him creating this altar has affected their destinies. And they may not have had any revelation about who God was. Jacob did, but they trusted Jacob's revelation, right? Because that's what they had to lean on, and it seemed to work. And then you fast forward, and somebody says, "Oh, God was my healer, Jehovah Rapha." They named that place Jehovah Rapha, right? And they're like, "Oh, God has manifested himself as a healer here. Oh, the Lord has revealed himself, Jehovah Yireh. That's his revelation, revealed himself to me." That's a revelation. That's a point. And all these points were a revelation of who God was in that season to them, or in that season of the nation even. And as God was revealing his goodness left and right, as people are learning to sacrifice their brokenness, as they're learning to build these altars, and God says, "I want to reveal a little bit more of myself." Just like you're saying, it's like on that Christian walk that we take, or as we're following Jesus, he's like, "Let me reveal a little more of myself here now." He's like, that takes you sacrificing something.
Yes.
You have to put something down. You got to put a down payment on that. I heard a preacher once, he made a statement about earnest money. He's like, you got to put your earnest money on the table first, and then we can talk about a down payment, right? How much you got? And it's like, Jesus is like, well, what you got? Just like in the burning bush, Moses is like, I don't have any tools. And Jesus is like, what you got? He's like, I got a stick. Great, we'll use that. It's like, Jesus just wants what you got. That's it. And if he needs more from you, he'll give you more to get. That's it. That's the beauty of it. It's a transaction. It's a transaction that always brings increase. And that's the revelation of an altar.
And it's always his stuff.
It's always his stuff.
That is true. That is so true.
I want to kind of circle back around to that lifting of the hands and that moment of worship, right? Because there's a compounding effect on that. That the more you give, the more you get to give. But there's also a flip side, right? Because sometimes it's an exchange of currencies. Sometimes you're exchanging brokenness and you get joy back, right? It's like you give something gravely, and then God's like, that's cool. I'm glad that you gave me that. That's a good step. Now I'm going to give you joy. And give me that too, and I'm going to produce more joy. And there's a first fruit sacrifice, which is the first one. That's a sacrifice of joy. I got crops this year. I'm not going to starve. I'm so happy. Like, we're in this modern world where we go to the grocery store and can buy food. We don't worry about starving unless we can't pay our bills. That's the only time. But the food is there and it's available. It's there. It's always there.
True.
So we don't have any concept of starving. But the rest, and there are parts of the world that is not so. Sometimes the crops don't come in and you're like, oh no, I might starve. So that first fruit offering is saying, man, this thing that's going to keep me from starving this year, I'm going to give you a piece of that because I'm happy and I want to share it with you. And it kind of ties into that concept of like, I want to give God the thing that brings me joy.
Yeah.
Because I want to share it with him.
Yeah. And I love it because we've delved into all the different components of what truly makes what truly gives a Christian dominion over a territory, over their lives, or whatever the case is. We've talked about altars, we've talked about worship, we've talked about brokenness to a certain extent, and I think it's just so powerful that we are able to have this conversation over the microphone. And I'm just glad that I'm a part of. My heart is so full just listening into this. Truly, that's all I wanted to say. My heart is so full. I'm like, man, just being able to just have this conversation with you, gentlemen, it's just such a powerful. It's just a powerful revelation for me. Truly, truly.
Amen. I reflect that sentiment.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our heart is full knowing that you're listening to. We hope that this has been a blessing to you. We hope this has shined some light on it. The principle for building an altar is truly the cornerstone principle of any discipleship walk. And I can't wait to talk about what other principles God is wanting to grow in our lives.